Good evening, everyone. We are now in the book of Leviticus, chapter 12. Chapter 12 follows on with an and then. It's important for us to remember that all these times I've highlighted this and then with a particular purpose. This really tells us that this continues on from chapter 11 after some time. And what is important now is for us to realize chapter 11, when we ended yesterday, is to tell us about the treatment of clean and unclean. The idea of unclean is tame, and being unclean is a concept, something that is not pure, right? Not pure. It is something that, how should we say, contaminated. All these are important concepts to bear in mind. The intent of really unclean is a need to wash off. And yesterday we saw the washing off is very much an act of immersion. And with the act of immersion, you also see that there is a period of uncleanness. This is also a very important aspect. Now, with this in mind, the whole intent is to tell the sons of Israel how to be different, how to deal with what God calls unclean. Notice this is not what man calls unclean. This is what God calls unclean. God made everything. And on day 6, at the end of it in Genesis chapter 1, we are told that everything was very good. Things were working together in harmony, and it's according to what God had planned. Now, suddenly, here in chapter 11 and now into chapter 12, we are introduced to the concepts of clean and unclean. Tame is unclean, tahor is pure. And tahor and tahir, all these are verbs and nouns that leads us to the understanding of clean and unclean. And these are understandings as given by God. Please be aware that these are not human invention, which is why God says, be holy because I am holy. You have to do this so that you are identified and distinguished clearly what is pure and clean and what is unclean. And with that in mind, God wants the sons of Israel, all of them, the nation of Israel, to be clean, especially when they come to approach God at the tabernacle or the temple. Now, with that said, at the end of chapter 11, we saw how to deal with animals that are unclean, particularly their carcass, not when they are alive. When they are alive, nothing is said. But when they are dead, then they're not supposed to touch all these things. Both the clean and unclean animal, especially when a clean animal died by itself and it is not slaughtered. And if they eat it, it will be unclean. And so all of these rules of eating is a matter of God declaring clean and unclean. Remember, I had also highlighted that the idea of hygiene and health, it is secondary. It is for them to obey so that it can be distinguished that these people are special. These people are unique. because Jehovah, their God, is special, is unique, is holy. Now we come to chapter 12, and it carries on this concept of clean and unclean. And so we begin in chapter 12, starting from verse 1. It's a relatively short chapter, but in the same instance, we need to know who is speaking, who is the primary audience, who is the secondary audience, and why are some of these things discussed. In today's chapter, anytime you read about clean and unclean, it's God's decision, God's people, God's rules. And in God's rules, he now gives us in chapter 12 a picture of what happens to the woman. So notice the words that is being spoken. And then Jehovah, he is the speaker, and he spoke to Moshe, to Moses, saying, so we now have God speaking to Moses. And this is what he is saying. He is telling Moses, speak to the children of Israel. And so these will be the intended audience for Moses to speak to them. So all of these is not difficult as long as we pay attention to it. Now, children of Israel literally means sons of Israel. Now, oftentimes we don't like the word sons of Israel. We like children of Israel. But unfortunately, that's not how the text is expressing. The text is really expressing to the sons, not to general children of Israel. And it is to instruct them on these things. The thing is in verse 2, say this, a woman. Now notice it's about a woman. And in this case, the Isha. A woman here would be the wife. The wives, a married status. And so the sons of Israel are to teach their wives. So the wives become a secondary audience. God speaking to Moses, speaking to the sons of Israel for them to teach their women what to do. And in the teaching here in chapter 12, we read, if a woman has conceived. This is a very unique word. Really, the word here is used very rarely. It's more so used for sowing. When you sow seeds, meaning when you drop the seed into the ground and the seed starts to germinate, and that's this meaning. The woman has a seed, or how should we say? The woman causes seed to grow, and that would be in herself. And so chapter 12 has to do with the process of pregnancy, conception, and birth, and what comes around this. Now remember, bear in mind the Hebrew people are very much like Eastern Oriental people. Much of everything that is being discussed are things that we can actually see, hear, touch, feel, taste. Now, all of these are aspects of Eastern Oriental life, and the Hebrew people are no different. And so, in the process of the woman conceiving, Whereas if you read in other chapters like Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, and you see the word conceive, it's really not the word conceive. The word conceive is properly used here as a matter of the seed in her is germinating. Whereas in the other parts of the Bible, when we talk about pregnancy, it is about being able to see the stomach growing in size, and that's called pregnant. In this case, it is conception. And how did they know all these things? And now this is what God is telling them what's inside the woman as the seed in her starts to germinate. Next, we have this expression, this word, and uh, once she conceives, and she's also in the state to bear a male child. When you see this idea of male child, you should be looking also for a female child. So in this case, when she conceived and gives birth to a male child, the state would be this. And this is also very similar to Eastern Oriental practice that a woman who gives birth is considered also unclean in many cultures. In the Hebrew culture, God is saying, she shall be unclean 7 days. Typical process of menstruation, essentially. So, this idea of unclean, or she is considered unclean. That's why the word here, unclean, tameh, she's considered unclean 7 days. In Eastern Oriental cultures, women who are unclean are really treated to be separated from the rest. That whatever she touches is deemed to be impure. And that is the cultural aspects of Eastern Orientals. As in the days of her customary impurity, she shall be unclean. Now, these words need to be expressed. Customary impurity. The 7 days is the customary menstruation. This word here is the menstruation of illness. That's the words that's been used for customary impurity. Customary impurity is a modern expression. Literally, it is menstruation, which is the rejection of the blood that the woman will bleed. Impurity, it's not even there in the Hebrew, it's of illness. Meaning, in this period of menstruation, women are feeling pain. Sickness is about pain, illness is about pain. And so the menstruation pain is considered or viewed upon, or they use the word illness. So, menstruation of illness, 7 days. And so we have this aspect that we can draw 7 days. Then she is considered unclean, right? She's considered tameh. Then we are told for her, verse 3, and on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. This is also the rule that all sons of Israel must remember and must teach the wife. Besides her being unclean, the child that's born, which is the male child here, on the 8th day, now we are told about circumcision. This word Circumcised literally means to be cut off. By itself, circumcised doesn't literally mean what we think it means in the English. It is a very generic word. Circumcised literally means mul. We have the idea in Leviticus 19, in fact. If you remember in Leviticus 19, later on we will talk about that. It is, in a sense, there will be an aspect of fruit trees being uncircumcised, to be cut off for a period of time. And so here we are told circumcision by itself is generic. You cannot understand what circumcised or mul is unless the context is clear. And the context tells us the flesh of his foreskin. So a very specific part to be cut off. And so this is the context of the circumcision on the 8th day for the male child that is born. I'm giving you a little bit more information because we have a short chapter, so we can spend a little bit of time explaining some of these words. Now, besides the 7 days, she shall then continue in the blood of her purification 33 days. This also tells us for another 33 days, she is in a different process. The word continue is she remains, she sits. She sits down in her blood of purification. It's a process for childbirth. After childbirth, there is still blood flow. And in that sense, she is considered unclean for 33 days. In the law for this, we are also told that she shall not touch any holy things. Hallowed things means holy things. Holy means you can't bake anything for an offering. You cannot be consuming anything that is taken back from the offering. In Leviticus chapter 1 to 7, occasionally you find that in certain offerings, some of these offerings are also taken back to be consumed by the family, and she would not be allowed to touch any of them. She's not allowed to come into the temple or the tabernacle, into the holy place, because she is unclean until the days of her purification are completed. Which means by this time, day 40, that will be fine. Now, this is a process that we have to bear in mind. So the question many people will ask is, why so? Just like yesterday when we were talking about the clean and unclean animals. Why? Because God said so. In Genesis chapter 9, all animals are given as food. But in Leviticus chapter 11, 99% of all the animals that God had made are considered unclean. And only that small number of animals in very specific rules that God has given that they can actually eat. And so, in so doing, why? The answer is, don't ask why. God's people, God's rules. God wants clean to approach him. Unclean, don't come. And so here in chapter 12, when the woman is considered unclean, remember, she is considered unclean as a law by God. And so when God considers this particular state as unclean, then the people will treat her unclean and she cannot come to God in the sanctuary, the tabernacle, or the temple. Now, in verse 5, it continues this way. It says, if she bears a female child. So just now we talked about a male, now we talk about a female child. Then the rules are changed. The rules say this: she shall be unclean for 2 weeks. This word 2 weeks uh, in verse 5 literally means Shavuim. It is week, the word week in a dual form. Dual means two. So 2 weeks. She will be unclean or considered unclean for 2 weeks, which means this. We now have here to here, this would be 14. As in her customary impurity. Remember, customary impurity is menstruation of illness. That's what it means. Menstruation of illness. It is considered unclean in this particular menstruation state. And she shall continue in the blood of her purification 66 days. And we have here 66 days. This is a total of 80 days. This is double if she has a female child. Again, people will ask, why so? What's the difference between a male and a female? The text here just doesn't tell us. Obviously, there has been a lot written about this, and the Jews obviously talk a lot about this because it concerns them. And they have all their writings, their discussions, their discourses, and their explanations, which I feel that it would not be the scope of our study today. Suffice for us to be aware, God's people, God's rules, and these are the rules that God made for the woman who had given birth, a male child and a female child, in two different and distinct periods considered unclean. That's all we ever need to know about this up to verse 5. Verse 6. Verse 6 continues on at the end of her purification period. Her end of purification period will be at the end of the period 40 days for a male child, 80 days for a female child after childbirth, whether for a son or a daughter. She shall bring to the priest a lamb of the first year as an olah. Remember, an olah, more of a thanksgiving type. And an olah is a very important offering when you compare an olah to the sin offering here. A young pigeon or a turtle dove as a sin offering. This is a khatat. A khatat. Bear in mind, a burnt offering is more important than the sin offering, and that is why it is listed burnt offering first and the sin offering next. But in the order of making the offering, you must offer the sin offering first and then the burnt offering. You must deal with the sin and then you will have to give thanks. That is how the structure of the verse will be understood. Now, what is important here is clearly the priest is to do this offering for her. So she shall bring, the mother shall bring. Then a lamb of the first year. Now, when we talk about the lamb of the first year, we're not talking about just a sheep. This is a male lamb, which is a ram, right? A ram of the first year, not a female, a male. And she brings it, first describe this as a sin offering, a young pigeon. Now, if you are familiar, young pigeon is Yona. That's Jonah. That's the name. But it's a young pigeon or a turtle dove, a dove itself. Both are clean birds. And so God says, you need to bring either a pigeon or a turtle dove, a small one, as your sin offering. Well, the idea here is deal with the sin. But what sin has she done? And so understand that sin is not about uh, uh, a moral offense. It is just an offense, generically an offense, because she has been in a state of uncleanness and she was not allowed to come to the temple or the tabernacle to make any offering or to have anything to do with the services of the temple or the tabernacle, and not to be interfering with all the holy and special offerings that may affect the family. And so the first thing to do is to make covering for this state that she was unclean and now she wants to be atoned, to be covered of all these uncleanness that she has done the ritual. She has sat out for the period of 40 days or 80 days, depending on whether it's a boy or a girl. And then she comes to the temple or the tabernacle and offer a chata, a sin offering. Then she offers a ram for a burnt offering. So two offerings she is expected to make. One is to cover her sins, which is with regards to the uncleanness. And two is to thank God for a life. So she brings it to the door of the tabernacle of the meeting. He would be the priest, shall offer it before Jehovah and make atonement for her, make a covering. Remember, this is not a moral thing. It is a state. It is something that is natural. She just has to go through it. But because of this special situation that she is put into, with the fact that she gave birth in Eastern Oriental communities and cultures, the the women who give birth is considered unclean, and so that is the same practice here. After the atonement is made, then she will do the burnt offering. Why is this atonement required? She shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the reason for atonement. The atonement is to cover the uncleanness. And now she will be clean. In verse 7, this idea, and she will be clean. This is taher. Taher. She will be clean from her flow of blood. The flow of blood made her unclean for 40 days or for 80 days. And during this period of purification, she is in the process of being clean. And so once the atonement was made, then she will be declared or considered clean again. And so understand this. This is the law for her who has born a male or a female. Again, I have to point out to everyone that this word is not law. I don't like this word. This is the Torah. This is the instruction. And so in the nation of Israel, the women who give birth, the wives who give birth, needs to obey this Torah. Now, one of the questions that people ask is, if this is so as a Torah, then what then does it, how does it affect the men? Well, the men is to teach the women, and the women is to do this law in chapter 12. And so many of the Torah in the Bible that is given to the nation of Israel needs to be classified. Many of the Torah are for both men and women. Some of the Torah, like in chapter 12, speaks specifically about the women. Later, we will see some of the Torah that speaks specifically about the men. Yesterday, when we were reading the dietary law, it's for all men and women. And so all of these needs to be understood as how God gave the instructions in the book of Leviticus. And later on, you'll also see that some laws are given only for Aaron and his sons. So it is not true that the nation of Israel has a one monolithic law. The nation of Israel has a set of laws of various categories. And as such, different people are being spoken to, and they are the ones given the obligation to obey and to follow. Now we see the justice of God happening here in verse 8. In verse 8 says this, if she is not able to bring a lamb. Now, what is this not able to bring? We have seen this earlier on in Leviticus chapter 4 with regards to the chata and with regards to some other means, like in chapter 2, where when a person does not have the ability, it is not not in the hand, so not able. She does not have the power in her hand to bring a lamb, a ram in this case. And obviously, a ram would be more expensive than a dove, right? So the justice of God says this, you still need to do the olah as a thanksgiving, but you may bring two turtle doves or two young Yonah pigeons. Now, what does this actually mean? God says, I will treat the ram equal to two birds. If you are unable to afford it, then I will accept two turtle doves or two young pigeons. What is God trying to say? One as a burnt offering, the other as a sin offering. You see, a young pigeon or a turtle dove is already for the chata. And if she cannot bring the ram for the olah, right here, the olah, then one turtle dove or one young pigeon is okay for the olah. The other would be used for the chata. And so in total, two. That's how you count. It's not two birds for the olah. One for the olah and one for the chata. God will accept the birds. That's the easiest, the simplest, even the poorest amongst you will be able to afford a bird. There is a price to pay. And the price is variable because God is a just God. Because he can't expect the rich man and the poor man to be the same. The rich woman and the poor woman are not equal in social status, in financial ability. And so, does it mean only the rich can do this and the poor can't? God wants all women in Israel to do this. And so, God allows for a variableness in the Olah and the Chata when it comes to this particular thanksgiving and sin offering for a pregnant woman who has given birth and has gone through the ritual cleansing. And then finally, we are told in this way, the priest, the Kohen, shall make atonement for her, covering, and she will be considered taher. She will be considered clean, pure. And so this whole chapter has to do with God's view of clean and unclean, how to deal with the ritual uncleanness for a woman who has given birth. One condition for a male child, one condition for a female child, and we should disregard all the debates about why it's different because it's God's people, God's rules. Why can't I eat this? Why can't I eat that? God's people, God's rules. By doing so, you are holy. You are different. You are unique. You are set apart. And when you follow these laws, I can accept you and you can come back to the temple or the tabernacle and make your offerings. So women do give offerings, not just the men, although the men generally represents the family. And so we now have laws for women, and in this case, married women who have given birth. Later, we will see laws for women who are menstruating, and that would apply to young girls as well. And so, what I'm trying to help all of us see as we go on in the book of Leviticus is that God has specific rules for specific segments of society, such that each segment, when they follow it, there will be peace and harmony within the community and the social fabric and the nation of Israel. And when other nations see them, they can see a very unique, very different nation. Whatever they practice is very unlike all other nations because God, Jehovah, is different. And so his people are also different. And the only way for the nation of Israel to be seen to be different is when they do these things that God tells them to do, and then they can be seen by others as different, as holy, as unique, as set apart. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.